The Mafia boss came to collect a debt, but took a desperate single mom instead. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's return to our main character, Emily Carter. Emily sat in the dimly lit kitchen of her small apartment, staring at the bills scattered across the table in front of her. The weight of the world seemed to press down on her shoulders, a single mother doing everything she could to make ends meet. Her son, Jake, was asleep in the next room, blissfully unaware of the financial chaos consuming their lives. She had worked hard, juggling 2 jobs, but the rent was overdue, the car payments were late, and now, the last straw had arrived. A letter from a loan shark, Dominic Romano *. The name sent a chill down her spine. She had heard the rumors. The whispers about how dangerous he was, how his family controlled the streets, how they didn't take kindly to unpaid debts. She had no idea how her late ex-husband had gotten involved with such people, but now it seemed like the past was catching up with her. She had tried everything, asking for extensions, finding side gigs, cutting back on every expense. But none of it had been enough. The knock on the door startled her. It was late, way too late for anyone to be visiting. Her heart raced as she pushed herself away from the table, cautiously walking to the door. She peered through the peephole. Standing there, bathed in the harsh light of the hallway, was a tall man in a dark suit. His face was unreadable, his presence commanding, and his eyes seemed to pierce straight through her. Dominic Romano. She felt her stomach tighten in fear. Before she could react, he knocked again, more forcefully this time. She opened the door, trying to steady her breath. "Miss Carter." His voice was calm, almost too calm. "I'm Dominic Romano. I'm here to collect a debt." Emily's mind raced. She had never met him before, but she knew who he was. Everyone did. The Mafia boss. The man who ran the streets with an iron fist. "I don't have the money," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I know you don't," he said, his eyes scanning the room, taking in every detail with a cold, calculating gaze. "But your ex-husband owed a lot of people, and now it's time to collect." His gaze shifted back to her, narrowing slightly. "The thing is, Miss Carter, I don't want your money. I want you." She blinked in disbelief, trying to process what he had just said. "What do you mean?" she stammered, confusion and fear bubbling inside her. "You're mine now. I'm taking you with me," Dominic said, his voice low but firm. The weight of his words hit her like a punch to the stomach. Her heart pounded in her chest, her legs trembling as she stepped back, unable to process what was happening. She had no choice but to follow him. He had her trapped. The next few hours passed in a blur. She was escorted into a sleek black car, the engine roaring to life as they sped through the city. Her hands were shaking, her thoughts racing, but all she could focus on was the looming figure sitting beside her. Dominic didn't say much during the ride. He didn't need to. His mere presence was enough to make her feel small, powerless. The city lights blurred past the window, but Emily wasn't sure if she was more afraid of the darkness outside or the man beside her. When the car finally came to a stop, Dominic led her into an imposing mansion. The walls were lined with expensive art, the floors gleamed with black marble, and the air seemed thick with an unsettling sense of power. She followed him in silence, her mind in a daze. This was the life she had never imagined for herself. She had spent years trying to create a safe, normal life for Jake. And now, she was at the mercy of a Mafia boss. "Welcome to my world, Miss Carter," Dominic said, his voice soft but unmistakable in its dominance. "You'll learn quickly what it means to belong to me." The mansion loomed over her, its cold, imposing presence swallowing Emily's small form as she stood in the entrance. The black marble floors gleamed like polished stone, reflecting the crystal chandeliers above. She had never seen anything like this in her life. This was a world she didn't belong to, yet here she was. Dominic had said she was his, but the reality of it was still sinking in. She had hoped this was some kind of mistake, a temporary nightmare she could wake up from, but deep down, she knew this was her new reality. The door clicked shut behind her, and she turned to see Dominic standing just a few steps away, his expression unreadable. "Welcome to my world," he said, his voice smooth and commanding. Emily couldn't respond. Her throat felt tight, and she felt a surge of panic rise in her chest. She had no idea what to do now. "Don't worry," Dominic continued, his eyes glinting with something that almost seemed like amusement. "You'll get used to it." Emily felt a shiver run down her spine. His words were not comforting, and his tone only amplified the unsettling feeling that had settled in the pit of her stomach. She looked around, trying to make sense of her surroundings. The mansion was vast, with high ceilings and expensive artwork hanging on the walls. Every piece seemed to scream wealth, power, and control. She was in a different world now, and it felt like there was no way out. Dominic motioned for her to follow him, his steps echoing through the hall as he led her further into the mansion. "This is where you'll stay," he said, stopping in front of a door at the end of a long hallway. He opened it to reveal a luxurious room. A king-sized bed sat in the center, surrounded by ornate furniture. Large windows overlooked the city, the view breathtaking. But none of it mattered to Emily. The room, no matter how beautiful, felt suffocating. "You'll be comfortable here," Dominic said, his voice colder now. "Everything you need will be provided." He turned to leave, but before he could, Emily found her voice. "Why me?" she asked, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to stay calm. Dominic paused, his back still to her. From Dominic himself made it all too real. She was nothing more than a pawn in his world, a world where her worth was determined by the mistakes of someone else. "I'm not a piece of property," she said, her voice stronger than before, though still filled with uncertainty. Dominic's eyes flicked toward her for a brief moment before he stepped closer, his presence overwhelming. "You are now," he said, his tone final. "And if you play your part well, maybe you'll find this world more to your liking." Emily recoiled slightly, her heart pounding. She didn't know what he meant by that, but the thought of being controlled by him, of being forced into a life she hadn't chosen, made her stomach churn. "I'll never belong to you," she whispered, more to herself than to him. Dominic's lips curled into a small, almost imperceptible smile. "We'll see about that," he said softly before turning and leaving the room, leaving her standing there alone, her mind racing. Emily sank onto the bed, trying to steady her breathing. She had no idea how she was going to survive this. But she knew one thing for sure. This wasn't just a temporary arrangement. She was trapped in Dominic's world, and now she had to figure out how to survive in it. Emily sat on the edge of the bed, her hands trembling as she gripped the fabric of her shirt. The room felt cold, despite the warmth of the mansion, and the silence was suffocating. She could hear the faint hum of the city in the distance, but it did nothing to calm the storm of thoughts raging in her mind. She had never been in a situation like this before. All her life, she had fought for control, for independence. But now, she was at the mercy of a man she didn't even know. A man who had taken her from her apartment, from her son, and forced her into a life she never wanted. Dominic had said she was his. It echoed in her mind like a broken record, the weight of those words pressing down on her chest. She had never felt so small, so powerless. Her mind kept returning to Jake, her little boy. What was he doing right now? Was he asleep, waiting for her to come home? She couldn't bear the thought of him being alone, of him waking up and finding her gone. She stood up and walked to the window, staring out at the city below. The lights were a blur in the darkness, like stars scattered across the sky. But to her, they felt as distant as her old life. She had no idea what to do, no idea how to get out of this. The door opened behind her, and she turned to see Dominic standing in the doorway. His presence filled the room, his dark eyes locking onto hers with that same intensity she had seen earlier. She stiffened, her heart racing. "You should get some rest," he said, his voice softer than before, though still carrying that underlying authority. Emily didn't answer. She wasn't sure what to say. She wasn't even sure what she wanted. Dominic stepped into the room, his gaze never leaving her. He seemed to be studying her, as if trying to understand what was going on in her mind. "You're scared," he said, his tone almost thoughtful. "Of course I'm scared," she snapped, the frustration boiling over. "You've taken me away from everything I know. I have a son who needs me. And now I'm trapped in this place with you." Dominic's expression softened just a fraction, though the hardness in his eyes remained. I didn't bring you here to hurt you, Emily, he said quietly. But you need to understand something. I don't like being crossed. Your ex-husband crossed me, and now you're here to pay for his mistakes. Emily felt a knot tighten in her stomach. I didn't do anything wrong, she whispered, her voice cracking slightly. I'm not him. Dominic's gaze softened for a moment, but then it hardened again. You don't need to do anything wrong for me to claim what's mine, he said, his voice low and controlled. You belong to me now. That's how it works. Emily's breath caught in her throat. She wanted to argue, to scream, to tell him that she wasn't his to take. But the words stuck in her throat. She didn't know what kind of man Dominic was, but she knew he had power. And that power was terrifying. He watched her for a long moment, his eyes unwavering. Finally, he turned and walked toward the door. I'll have your things brought in here, he said, his back to her. Get some rest. Tomorrow, we begin. Emily stood frozen by the window, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but she knew one thing for sure. Her life had changed forever, and there was no going back. Emily woke up to the sound of soft footsteps in the hallway outside her room. She didn't know what time it was, but the feeling of unfamiliarity and unease still lingered from the night before. The air in the room felt colder now, and the weight of the luxury around her seemed almost suffocating. The opulent surroundings of the mansion felt like a far cry from the small, cramped apartment she once called home. She slowly pushed herself up from the bed, her muscles stiff from a restless night. She had been unable to sleep much, her mind spinning with thoughts of what had happened and what was to come. The world outside her window seemed so distant, so unreachable. The faint light of morning filtered through the curtains, casting long shadows across the room. She glanced at the large wardrobe across the room, where new clothes had been placed, tailored to fit her. It was strange, the way everything here seemed designed for comfort and luxury, yet none of it could ease the anxiety gripping her chest. Emily stood and walked to the window, looking out over the sprawling grounds. The mansion stood in stark contrast to her life before, the life she had fought so hard to build. She thought of Jake, her son, and how he must be feeling without her. She had promised him she would always be there, and now she had broken that promise. Her chest tightened at the thought, the guilt almost unbearable. Miss Carter, a voice called from the doorway, and Emily turned to see one of the staff members standing there, a man in a neatly pressed uniform. Dominic has requested your presence. The use of her last name felt too formal, too distant. It reminded her that in this world, she was not Emily anymore. She was a pawn in Dominic's game. She nodded silently, and the man stepped aside to let her pass. As she followed him through the hallways of the mansion, Emily's mind raced. What was Dominic planning? Why had he brought her here, and what did he want from her? She had no answers, only questions that seemed to grow. With each passing moment, she reached a large set of doors, which the man opened with a polite gesture. Inside, Dominic stood near the window, his back to her as he gazed out at the view. His presence was commanding, and despite the distance between them, she could feel his power in the room. He didn't turn around when she entered, but his voice broke the silence. I trust you slept well, he said, his tone casual, but with an underlying authority that made her uneasy. I didn't sleep much, Emily replied, her voice shaky despite her best effort to sound composed. Dominic turned to face her, his eyes cold and calculating. You won't need much sleep, not when you're in my care. His words hit her like a slap, and she quickly looked away, unable to meet his gaze. What do you want from me? She asked, the question hanging heavily in the air. Dominic took a few steps toward her, his presence filling the space. What I want, he said, his voice low and deliberate, is for you to understand that you're mine now. Everything you do, everything you are, is under my control. Emily felt a shiver run down her spine at his words. There was no room for negotiation, no chance to escape. She was trapped in his world, bound by the invisible chains he had placed around her. But I'm not your property, she said, her voice more defiant than she felt. Dominic's lips twitched into a small smile, but it was devoid of warmth. You are now, he said simply, before turning away from her, and you will learn what it means to belong to me. Emily wanted to argue, to scream that she didn't belong to him, but deep down, she knew it was pointless. She was already in too deep, and there was no way out. The door closed behind her with a soft click, and she was left standing in the silence of the room, her mind racing. How had she gotten here? How had she gone from a simple life, fighting for her son's future, to being at the mercy of a mafia boss? She had no answers, only the overwhelming realization that her life was no longer her own. She was Dominic Romano's, for better or for worse. The thought terrified her more than anything else. As she walked back to the guest room, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of something much darker than she had ever imagined. Emily stood by the large windows, staring out at the sprawling estate below. The mansion was quieter now, the hustle and bustle of the earlier day fading into a peaceful stillness. But peace was the last thing Emily felt. The weight of the situation pressed down on her, and the uncertainty about what would happen next seemed to grow with every passing moment. Dominic's words echoed in her mind. "You belong to me now." It had been a few days since she had been brought here, and the reality of her new life was beginning to settle in. Every part of the mansion screamed power, wealth, and control, things she had never had. She had spent her life working hard to provide for Jake, scraping by just to make sure they could survive. But now, she wasn't just struggling for herself. She was struggling for her son's future. Her heart ached as she thought of him. She had no idea how he was handling everything. Was he okay? Was he asking about her? She missed him more than words could say. But she couldn't let him know where she was. Not yet. Dominic had made it clear that she was his responsibility now, and any attempt to escape would only make things worse. Emily had seen the way he operated, calm, calculating, and with an iron grip on everything around him. It was hard to imagine how a man like him could care about anyone other than himself. And yet, a part of her couldn't help but wonder. Maybe there was more to him than the cold exterior he put up. She shook the thought away. It didn't matter. She had to focus on the reality of her situation. She couldn't afford to get distracted by anything else. "Miss Carter," a voice called from behind her, and Emily turned to see one of the house staff standing in the doorway. "Dominic is expecting you." The words sent a wave of anxiety through her chest. She had been avoiding him as much as possible, finding every excuse to stay in her room or wander around the grounds. But now, there was nowhere to hide. She nodded silently, her mind racing with questions. What did he want now? What more could he demand from her? She followed the staff member down the hallway, each step feeling heavier than the last. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was walking deeper into the maze of Dominic's world, with no way out. When they reached his office, the door opened silently, and she stepped inside. Dominic was standing by his desk, his back to her as he looked out the window. The room was just as imposing as the rest of the mansion, luxurious, filled with dark wood furniture and expensive decor. The air was thick with a sense of authority, and she could almost feel the weight of his gaze on her even though he hadn't turned around yet. "Sit down, Emily," he said, his voice calm, but with a tone that brooked no argument. She hesitated for a moment before sitting in the chair across from him. She kept her hands folded in her lap, trying to maintain some semblance of control. But the tension in the room was palpable, and she couldn't stop herself from feeling a little bit nervous. Dominic turned around slowly, his eyes locking with hers. For a moment, there was silence, and she could feel the weight of his gaze like a physical presence. "You've been avoiding me," he said, his voice smooth, but with an edge of something she couldn't quite place. "I'm not avoiding you," Emily replied, her voice steadier than she felt. I don't know what you want from me." Dominic raised an eyebrow, studying her carefully. "What I want is simple. I want you to understand that you're here because of me, and that you will do as I say. There is no room for negotiation." Emily swallowed hard. She wasn't sure what was worse, the idea of being controlled by him or the fact that she was completely powerless in this situation. "I don't belong here," she said, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to remain composed. Dominic's lips twitched into the faintest smile. "You're wrong," he said softly. "You belong exactly where you are." He leaned forward, his gaze never leaving hers. "You'll learn soon enough that this world, my world, doesn't leave room for mistakes. You will follow the rules, or you'll face the consequences." Emily felt a chill run down her spine. She had no idea what the consequences would be, but she knew. They wouldn't be good. She nodded silently, trying to suppress the fear that threatened to overwhelm her. Dominic stood up and walked around the desk, his movements deliberate, almost predatory. "You don't have to like it, Emily," he said, stopping just in front of her. But you'll come to understand that this is how things are. This is how I run my world. And you're a part of it now. He placed his hand gently on her shoulder, a gesture that would have felt comforting if it hadn't come from him. We'll see if you can adapt, he said quietly. You'll learn. In time. The words hung in the air like a promise, and Emily couldn't shake the feeling that, in this world, nothing was ever truly as it seemed. Emily had been living in Dominic's world for several days now, and every moment felt like a constant battle between her mind and her emotions. She had learned to adapt in some ways, but it wasn't easy. The mansion, despite its grandeur, felt like a cage, and she had never felt more trapped in her life. She was constantly under watch, constantly reminded that she belonged to him now. His words haunted her at every turn. You belong to me now. It had been a few days since that conversation, and though she had hoped things would change, they hadn't. Dominic had kept his distance, but there was always an air of expectation hanging between them. Emily spent most of her time in her room, pacing back and forth, trying to think of a way to escape. But with every passing day, the reality of her situation seemed more impossible to escape. She had no one to turn to, no way out. Dominic's presence loomed over her like a dark cloud, his eyes always watching her, studying her. It made her feel like a prisoner. Her mind would often drift back to her son, Jake. She couldn't stop thinking about him. How was he doing? Was he scared? Did he even know where she was? The guilt ate away at her. She had promised him she would always be there. But now, she couldn't keep that promise. She was stuck here, in this mansion, under Dominic's control. The door to her room creaked open, and Emily quickly wiped away the tear that had slipped down her cheek. She didn't want to show any weakness. She couldn't afford to. Dominic stood in the doorway, his gaze sharp and piercing as always. We need to talk, he said simply, his voice calm but authoritative. Emily swallowed hard and nodded, stepping out from behind the desk where she had been sitting. She didn't know what this meeting was about, but she knew it wouldn't be good. She followed him down the hall, the silence between them thick with tension. The walls of the mansion felt like they were closing in on her. Every step she took seemed to echo, reminding her of the heavy weight on her shoulders. When they reached his office, Dominic opened the door and gestured for her to enter. She stepped inside, feeling the familiar unease creep up her spine. She had never felt more out of place in her life. Dominic's office was large, with dark wood furniture and expensive artwork on the walls. The air was thick with power and authority, and Emily couldn't help but feel small in his presence. She stood across from his desk, unsure of what to say. Dominic sat down slowly, his eyes never leaving her. You've been here long enough to know how things work, he said, his voice low and steady. I don't tolerate defiance. Emily stood straighter, her heart racing. She knew exactly what he was referring to. The small acts of rebellion she had shown, the quiet defiance. She had tried to keep a sense of control, but it had become clear that Dominic wouldn't tolerate any of it. I'm not trying to defy you, she said, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to remain composed. I'm just trying to understand what's happening, what you want from me. Dominic's gaze softened, just slightly, but his tone remained firm. I've told you before. You're here because you belong to me now. Everything about you, everything you do, will be under my control. It's simple. Emily clenched her fists at her sides, fighting the urge to shout. I don't belong to you, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Dominic stood up then, moving around the desk toward her. His steps were slow, deliberate. When he reached her, he stopped just inches away, his presence overwhelming. You do, he said softly, his breath warm against her skin. And you will learn to accept it. He paused for a moment, studying her expression. I'm not a monster, Emily, but I won't tolerate disobedience. Do you understand? She nodded, though every part of her wanted to refuse, to fight back. But she couldn't. She was in his world now, and she had no choice but to follow his rules. Good, Dominic said, his voice calm again. He turned and walked back to his desk, his back to her. You'll start working with me more closely from now on. I need you to understand how things operate here. There's no room for mistakes. Emily didn't respond. She couldn't. Her throat felt tight, and she felt as though the air in the room had grown thicker. Dominic sat back down in his chair and looked up at her once more. I'll give you time to adjust, he said, his voice more matter-of-fact now. But don't mistake my patience for weakness. I'll be watching you, Emily. Every step you take. She stood there, motionless, her mind racing with 1,000 thoughts. How had she ended up here? How had her life gotten to this point? The more she thought about it, the more she realized there was no easy way out. Dominic had made sure of that. She was stuck, and there was nothing she could do to change it. Emily sat in the chair across from Dominic, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. She had been living in the mansion for over a week now, and each day felt like it added another layer of unease. She still wasn't used to the silence of the place, the constant feeling of being watched. The staff moved like shadows in the background, always present but never speaking unless spoken to. And then there was Dominic. His presence was everywhere, always looming, always watching. She had tried to push back against his control, but it was becoming clear that the more she resisted, the tighter the grip he had on her. "You're still not getting it, Emily." Dominic's voice broke through her thoughts, pulling her back to the present. He sat across from her, his eyes sharp, studying her every move. "You've been living here for a while now, yet you still act like you have a choice. You don't." Emily looked at him, her chest tight with frustration. "I know I'm here because of your terms, but I'm not going to pretend like. I'm okay with it." She could feel her voice shake, but she pushed forward. "I didn't sign up for this. I didn't ask for this life." Dominic leaned back in his chair, a faint smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. "No one ever does," he said quietly. "But that's the thing about life, Emily. It doesn't ask for permission." He watched her for a moment, his gaze unwavering. "And neither do I." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Emily swallowed hard, feeling the weight of his control pressing down on her. She hated it. She hated how powerless she felt, how she was forced to accept the life he had imposed on her. But what could she do? She had no family left, no way out. Her thoughts always drifted back to Jake. She hadn't been able to contact him since she'd been brought here. Dominic had made it clear that communication with the outside world was restricted. She wasn't allowed to speak to anyone, not even her friends. "Do you miss him?" Dominic's voice cut through the silence once again, his question unexpected. "Your son, I mean." Emily's heart ached at the mention of Jake. She didn't want to talk about him, didn't want to admit how much she missed him. She looked down at her hands, unwilling to meet his gaze. "Of course I miss him," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "But I can't do anything about it." Dominic studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then he spoke again, his tone softer than before. "I understand," he said, his voice quieter. "It's not easy. I'm not here to make it easy for you, Emily. I'm here to make sure you understand your place." He paused, letting his words sink in. "You belong to me now, and that means everything about your life changes." Emily wanted to shout, to scream that she wasn't his, that she would never belong to him. But what was the point? She was already here, already trapped. "I don't belong to anyone," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm my own person." Dominic's eyes darkened slightly as he leaned forward, his gaze intense. "You may think that now," he said, his voice low and steady. "But eventually, you'll realize the truth. You've already been pulled into this world, and there's no going back." He stood up then, moving around the desk toward her. His presence filled the room, and Emily couldn't help but feel small under his gaze. "But I'm not all bad, Emily," he said softly. "I'm giving you a chance to stay here, to be a part of something bigger than yourself. You don't have to like it, but you will respect it." Emily clenched her fists, her heart pounding. She hated him for saying those words, for trying to convince her that this was the life she was meant to have. She didn't want any part of it. "I don't need your protection," she said, her voice steady despite the fear threatening to overwhelm her. Dominic's lips curled into a small smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "You'll change your mind eventually," he said, his voice still soft, but there was an edge to it now. "I'll make sure of that." As he turned to walk away, Emily felt a pang of helplessness wash over her. She didn't want to be here, didn't want to belong to him, but she had no choice. Her life was no longer her own, and that realization hit her harder than anything else. She was trapped in this world, a world where Dominic's rules were law, and there was no escaping it. The door clicked shut behind him, and Emily was left alone in the silence once more. She couldn't fight him anymore. Not yet, but she would find a way out. Somehow. Emily spent the next few days trying to adjust to life in Dominic's mansion, but no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't shake the feeling of being trapped. Every room in the mansion, every hallway, felt like it was closing in on her. It wasn't just the physical space that made her feel suffocated. It was the invisible walls that Dominic had built around her. She had no freedom, no control over anything. Dominic had made sure of that. She was no longer living her life. She was living by his rules. Every day was a reminder of that. Every time she walked past him, every time their eyes met, she was reminded that she belonged to him. She was constantly on edge, unsure of what he would do next, unsure of what he wanted from her. It was exhausting. But one thing was becoming clearer. She wasn't just a prisoner in his world. She was becoming a part of it. She had tried to keep her distance, to maintain some semblance of independence, but that was slowly slipping away. She had heard Dominic's warning. You'll learn to accept it. And despite her best efforts, she was starting to see what he meant. The mansion wasn't just a prison. It was a place where everything was controlled, where everything had its place, and where she had a role to play. Emily couldn't deny it. She had seen it in the way the staff moved around the mansion, silent, efficient, always doing what was expected of them. They didn't question, they didn't resist. They just did their jobs, and they did them well. Dominic had created this world, and in this world, there was no room for defiance. Emily hated the realization, but it was hard to ignore the truth. She was part of his world now, and the more she tried to fight it, the harder it became to separate herself from it. The thought terrified her, but she couldn't escape it. One evening, as she sat in her room, her mind racing with 1,000 thoughts, she heard a knock at the door. She knew it was Dominic. It had been a while since he had come to check on her, and she wasn't sure what to expect this time. She opened the door, and there he was, standing in the doorway, as calm and collected as ever. "We need to talk," he said simply. Emily's heart skipped a beat. She couldn't remember the last time she had felt so nervous around him. "What is it?" she asked, her voice betraying her unease. Dominic's eyes flicked over her briefly, as though assessing her every word, every movement. "It's time for you to start fulfilling your role," he said, his voice steady. Emily felt a knot tighten in her stomach. "What do you mean?" she asked, though she was afraid of hearing the answer. Dominic stepped closer, his presence overwhelming. "You've been living here for a while now. You've adjusted to the luxury, the comfort. But now it's time for you to understand the power that comes with being part of this world," he said, his voice low but commanding. "You don't just get to live here, Emily. You need to contribute." Emily recoiled slightly, her mind racing. "Contribute," she repeated, trying to understand what he was implying. Dominic's gaze never wavered. "You will start working with me," he said, his tone final. "You'll learn how things work, how we operate, and you'll be useful. In time, you'll understand why this is the life you were meant to lead." The words sent a chill through Emily's body. She didn't want to be useful to him. She didn't want to be part of this world, no matter what he said. "I don't want this life," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Dominic looked at her for a moment, his expression unreadable. "You don't have a choice," he said, his words cutting through the air like ice. "But you will. Eventually." He turned to leave, but then paused, looking back at her over his shoulder. "You'll come to see things my way, Emily. And when you do, you'll realize that this is the life you were always meant to have." The door closed behind him with a soft click, and Emily was left standing there, her thoughts in turmoil. She had no idea what was happening to her. She had no idea how she was supposed to survive this world. But one thing was certain. She was no longer just a passive observer. She was becoming part of Dominic's world, and that terrified her more than anything else. Emily spent the next few days in a fog, each one blending into the next. The mansion felt more like a gilded cage than a home. She went through the motions, eating when told to, attending to her assigned tasks, keeping her head down. She had learned quickly that if she stayed quiet and did what was expected of her, Dominic wouldn't engage much. But there were moments, quiet moments when she was alone in her room, that she allowed herself to think about everything. About how her life had shifted so drastically, about what Dominic wanted from her, about how much she missed Jake. She had tried writing him a letter, but every time she picked up a pen, the words wouldn't come. She knew she couldn't send anything from here. Even the simple act of writing felt like an act of rebellion in this strange world Dominic had made her a part of. Every day, she learned more about him, about his world. His influence stretched everywhere, even into the parts of her life she thought were beyond his reach. He had people watching her constantly, monitoring everything she did, making sure she followed his rules. She couldn't even leave the grounds without permission, and when she did, it was always with an escort. But Dominic's presence wasn't just controlling, it was suffocating. She had thought there might be moments of relief, moments where he would let her breathe. But even when he wasn't physically present, she could feel him in the air, a constant weight pressing down on her. It wasn't just his power that weighed on her, it was the power he had over her mind. The way he could make her question herself, make her feel like she had no choice but to fall in line. One evening, as she was walking down the grand staircase to the dining room, she heard voices. They were low, quiet, conversations taking place just out of reach. Dominic was standing in the hallway, talking to one of his men. Emily paused, unsure whether to continue or turn back. She had learned not to interrupt, not to ask questions. But her curiosity got the better of her, and she slowly stepped forward. She's still not accepting her place. Dominic's voice reached her ears, calm, but with a hard edge. She will, the man responded, his voice tinged with uncertainty. It's just taking longer than we expected. Emily froze, her heart pounding. She didn't know if they were talking about her, but she had a feeling they were. She's strong-willed, Dominic said, his tone softer now. But that's the beauty of it. It makes her more valuable. She'll understand eventually. She has to. Emily's chest tightened. She was standing there, listening to their conversation, but she didn't feel like a person anymore. She felt like a piece of property, a tool to be shaped and molded to Dominic's will. The thought made her stomach churn. She wanted to scream, to tell them she wasn't his, that she would never accept this life. But there was no point. It wouldn't change anything. As she turned and walked back down the hallway, she realized something. She couldn't escape. There was no way out of this life Dominic had thrust her into. She had tried to resist, to hold on to who she was. But it was becoming clear that Dominic wasn't going to let her go that easily. The mansion, the luxury, the constant watchful eyes, they were all part of the price she had to pay for being caught in his web. And the more she tried to fight it, the more it seemed like she was losing herself. She didn't want to belong to him, but every day, it felt more like she was being absorbed into his world. It wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about whether she would lose herself completely in the process. The next morning, as Emily sat at the breakfast table, Dominic walked in. His presence filled the room, and she couldn't help but stiffen. He had a way of making everything feel heavier, more important, even when nothing was happening. "Good morning, Emily," he said, his voice smooth and calm. Emily forced a smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Good morning." She kept her gaze down, her hands folded neatly in her lap. There was a long pause before Dominic spoke again, his voice suddenly taking on a more serious tone. "I've decided it's time for you to start contributing more," he said, leaning in slightly as if his words carried weight. "Your role here is still to be defined, but you'll start helping me with certain tasks." Emily's heart skipped a beat, and she looked up at him, her face betraying none of her inner turmoil. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice steady. Dominic's smile was small, but it was there, a knowing smile that made her skin prickle. "You'll find out soon enough," he said, standing up. "For now, finish your breakfast. I'll have someone come for you in an hour." He turned and walked out, leaving her alone in the room. She didn't know what he meant, but the unease in her stomach only grew. There was always something more, always another layer to this world he was forcing her to be a part of. And she was becoming more and more convinced that she wasn't just going to be a part of it. She was going to be consumed by it.